I would say the tone of the book is very readable, very accessible, so I found myself turning pages and looking at it one after another. I think in the case study of Berlin, which of course for us as architects based in Berlin had a particular relevance in terms of understanding Berlin in terms of a series of histories and the potential relationship between those histories. I think for me as an American coming to Berlin in the early 90s, these extremely dissonant conditions and edges were of a particular interest, as well as you say, the voids, the kind of emptiness in this city, as well as the kind of infill. So I think as architects we look for tools, we look for ways of operating here. So I think having a kind of understanding or a kind of cognizance of what these histories were and what these adjacencies, as well as the history of master planning, helped us to sort of locate ourselves and to think about how we might work here as architects or work here as urban planners and what that might mean. So I found for me in the publication in the book a kind of particular relevance of how we might think about the city as we work in a kind of maybe a typical trajectory of working from the peripheries, which is where we worked in the beginning, where our interest was on landscape and particularly damaged and demilitarized landscape, to slowly but surely starting to work towards the center where we're working in more public arena, more urban arenas, and begin to work in a much more tighter and complex, also political, capital context, and how these histories might contribute to that thinking. So as we both adhere to public policy planning, master planning, working with the city, and as I think we were saying a little bit earlier, is how do you also resist these things? How do you locate yourself? Where do you agree? Where can you disagree? And how can you use this thinking to situate your own work, which I think is important for us, because I don't think we simply want to fill in the blanks in a way that complies with urban planning. That's why we find ourselves actually in arguments about how we might work in some place like Großbierstadt, or how we might work in Heidestraße. So I think it's that kind of pushing back against some of these things, as in a sense armed with this kind of information that we're gleaning from a document such as this one. I think it helps us do this. The second aspect of your work is the comparative aspect to Beirut and Venice. Of course, we know Venice very well. We know Berlin very well. Beirut not so well. But the idea of a kind of global transience of thinking about relevancies between different cities, I think is a compelling argument. Are there ideas of Berlin that can have a kind of scalability to Venice and the other way around? I think as a kind of idea or a kind of content is an interesting one. Again, the idea of a kind of series of centers or series of islands has a, I mean, for me, has a high level of legibility as a kind of tactic, and how that might, there may be learning lessons from one place to the next, I think, is a compelling idea to think about. So, and probably goes to this idea of scalability as we're working from things that are this big to the scale of a building, to the scale of a master plan. So for us, as our practice expands, this kind of agility is an important one. So, and also I think what's great about your book is that, you know, we tend to, there's always the danger of sort of working like this. We're working on the thing that's in front of us, but I think you need a kind of intellectual trigger that makes you look at things stepping back a little bit and from the outside. So I think the idea of thinking this way helps us break out of the sort of argumentation that we have here, which sometimes become a little parochial, a little bit inclusive, to see things in a kind of, in your three cities, a kind of semi-global scale where there are similarities and differences, and I think that helps exercise this idea of a kind of intellectual agility where you can work and make applications in a different way. So I think therefore, you know, it becomes valuable for me, because we forget these things also. We forget about these histories, and we forget about the relevance of other cities. So if one can make what is, I would say, what is invisible somehow visible, then it helps us to construct arguments that ultimately help us construct things like buildings and master plans. Would I recommend your book? Yeah, well, I think so. Yeah, I think so. I think across the board. I mean, it could be. I think it's diverse. It could be interesting for students. It could be interesting for planners, for architects. I think it could have a certain application. Again, the tone we discussed, journalistic, I think, gives it an accessibility that we don't need to read an extremely dense theoretical approach to this, or a dense historical approach to, but the accessibility also, for me, means it can be instrumental, that it means we can think in a different way, we can use these ways for working, and I think this is important. So, and that spectrum from student to practitioner to someone who's in charge of policy, I think gives, in a way, the reader a kind of intellectual freedom that to choose, to sort of pick and choose a document through this, which for me, which was exciting to read about it, was it has historical components. It also has cultural ones, also from mass culture, from media culture, that makes it vivid, and it makes one is able to move from point to point in a much more inclusive way. So for me, I find it really valuable that way. I like this idea of a kind of a journalistic approach that allows it a kind of spontaneity and a sort of commentary that usually in our architectural reading is not particularly accessible. And the accessibility, I think, is important. And the accessibility gives it, I think, the possibility for a wider range of readership, and therefore relevance.